Welcome back, my little horrorlings. Are you ready for some more scary stories to give you nightmares? Well, gather round, 'cause Mama's got some good ones for you today. This story took place somewhere in the early 90s. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, and my younger brother was 5 or maybe 6. My brother slept in the smaller bedroom, his bed next to the radiator. He would often wake up in the middle of the night crying, saying he saw something, but my parents just assumed he was having a bad dream. I must add that he was scared easily and quick to cry, so my parents would comfort him and then get him to go back to sleep, not thinking much of it. One night he, again, woke up, screaming this time, scared to death. He said he saw a face in the radiator. He pulled his blankets over his head, but when he took them off, the face was still there. Then he threw his stuffed animal at it, but it still didn't go away. He was 100% sure that it wasn't a dream. Only when he started screaming for my parents the face would disappear. They asked him what the face looked like, and he said it was orange, like a pumpkin. We live in the Netherlands and Halloween wasn't a thing back then. One day my mum was cleaning his room when all of a sudden a battery-controlled police car that stood on a shelf went off on its own. It was the kind with a little switch on the bottom. It started driving, sirens on, drove right off the shelf, fell on the floor, and stopped. When my mum picked it up, the switch was off. She thought it was very strange. A few years later, my sister was born. Her nursery was in the room where my brother used to sleep. She had this hanging music box with a cord you pull, and it would often begin to play while the cord was up. Not just a few notes, but the whole song, which is impossible, but it did. We would hear her laying in her crib, laughing and giggling like someone was playing with her. When we'd go in to check, she was always looking at one particular spot, the radiator. It couldn't have been a coincidence. She must have seen the same thing that my brother saw. But why was my brother so afraid while my sister seemed to really like it? I've had this memory since the age of 5. Why is it so vivid and terrifying? A bit of background. I used to live in an old townhouse with my family. It was me, Mum, Dad, then my 5 other siblings. We were brats and would always play tricks on each other, but there is one trick that I've always vividly remembered, and it still has me scared 18 years later. I apologise for some details I can't remember due to poor memory, which makes it even more weird that I can recall this. I've talked to all of my family and no one has had anything like this happen, but do remember the night telling me that I was hysterical and wouldn't calm down while my dad checked around the house for someone. Nothing else though out of the normal. Basically, my sister and I shared a very small room. There was a bunk bed against the back wall with the door on the opposite side and a closet to the left, a window on the right. One night we were playing and my sister decided she would lock me in the room and turn the lights off. I was too short to reach the light switch and she held the door shut. I screamed and yelled and pulled, but she wouldn't open it. Then I remember the feeling of a hand on my shoulder before I shut my eyes and yelled. Suddenly I was ripped from the door and forcefully held on the bed. As I open my eyes, all I can see is a shadow of a man above me. Just like a void where someone should be. I stop screaming, fear taking over my tiny body, and I notice how quiet it is. No sounds from outside the room from my family, just my own heartbeat and shallow breathing. I watch the thing raise its arm and can see that it's holding something. Just as it reaches above its head, I see something shine in the moonlight before being quickly brought down. Then the lights turn back on and my sister is standing confused at the door. I'm laying on the bed, screaming with tears. I run out of the room past my sister to my mum and explain to the best of my ability that someone was in our room. Dad looked all over the house, but there was nothing. All the windows were closed, no one was under the bed, and no one was in the closet. I remember though, I recall vividly the feeling of someone holding me down. The shine from whatever it was holding, and the nothingness standing and leaning over me. I've always wondered why and what that thing was. Luckily, we moved out soon after that, due to other reasons not related to this incident, and it's never happened since. Although I often see a shadow of a person out the corner of my eye, but it's something that I have learned to ignore now. To start off my experience, I should say when I was younger, I would have these really strange dreams about a woman in a black dress. I decided to tell my mum about these weird dreams, and that was when she told me this story about something that happened to her a couple of days after she had given birth to me. She was extremely upset when she told me this story. It was as if she was reliving some traumatic experience, and she always becomes super upset and nervous whenever someone asks her to tell this story. This took place a couple of days after my mum had given birth to me. She was fresh out of the hospital and decided to invite my uncle to sleep over for a couple of weeks until she got back up on her feet. Something to point out is there was a cemetery behind the house that my mum lived in. Creepy, I know. For the first couple of nights, my mum would wake up to me crying at 3 a.m. and whenever she would check on me, I would be on the floor instead of my crib where she had put me to sleep. This would occur for about a week until one night my uncle was asleep in the living room and my mum was sleeping in her room when she felt a heavy pressure in her chest, as if someone was on top of her. She remembers opening her eyes where she saw an all-black figure of a man standing on top of her, covering her mouth. She describes the man as very thin and tall, with a huge smile on his face. All she could see was his eyes and mouth and feel the pressure of his hand covering her mouth. My mum describes her body as being in shock, as if the person paralysed her entire body to where she could only move her eyes. Seeing no other option, since she couldn't move, my mum thought the only thing to do was to close her eyes and beg to God. When she had finished her prayer, she opened her eyes again, and the man was gone. Super cliche, I know, but I can't make this stuff up. As soon as my mum stood up out of the bed, she heard me crying in distress extremely loudly, so she screamed for my uncle to run into my room and check on me, and that's when they both ran into my room and saw what they think was a witch holding me tight as if she was putting me to sleep. My mum and uncle were both terrified and attempted to grab me from the woman, but the door had slammed shut for about 2 minutes. When my mum and uncle were finally able to open the door, they found me on the floor, crying. That same night my mum packed up all our stuff and we stayed with my grandma up until her lease was up and she could find another place for us to live. My mum still tears up any time I ask about it. I'm almost 20 years old and I still occasionally think about what would have happened if my mum didn't move us from that place. Thank you for listening, my little horrorlings. Don't forget to leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of tonight's stories. Give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to find out first about new videos, and whatever you do, don't forget to check for monsters underneath your bed. Sweet dreams.